Hello everyone. In the final weeks of October 2007, all of Canada was shaken by news that 6 men had been executed inside an apartment in Surrey. It was clearly a gang-style hit, as the victims were all shot in the head at close range. That gruesome scene launched one of the longest, most dramatic investigative and courtroom battles in the country's law enforcement history. And most notably, the mastermind behind this monstrous plot was a Vietnamese-Canadian underworld figure who fled back to Vietnam immediately after the killings. So who was he? And why were those 6 men executed so brutally? Stay with Vietnamese Case Files until the very end as we untangle this haunting and complicated case. A quick note, all content in today's video is researched and compiled by our team from multiple sources. If there are any errors or details that need correction, please leave a comment below so we can update and fix them. And as always, before we get into the details, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss other gripping cases on Vietnamese Case Files. Thank you for your support. On the afternoon of October 19th, 2007, everyday life at Balmoral Tower, located at 9,830 Wally Blufford in Surrey, Canada, was abruptly shattered by a horrific discovery. Building manager Norman Carruthers, while checking on a unit on the 15th floor apartment, 1505, was horrified to find multiple bodies lying face down and motionless on the floor with blood scattered throughout. Panicked, he immediately called the police. Minutes later, the once quiet condominium was tightly sealed off by officers. Inside that 15th floor unit, the scene looked like an execution room. 6 male bodies were found sprawled across the living room and hallway. Several of them had jackets or hats pulled over their heads, as if the killer didn't want to look at their faces while pulling the trigger. Later autopsy results showed that most of the victims were shot from extremely close range in the back of the neck or the back of the head, a method associated with the underworld's leave no loose ends mentality. A total of 19 shell casings were recovered at the scene. There were no signs of forced entry. It appeared the victims had opened the door for the killer. The apartment had been ransacked, drawers and cabinets left wide open. Taken together, police quickly sensed from the start that this was a deliberate, gang-related purge. The killer stormed in, restrained the victims, searched for valuables, then calmly shot them one by one. But who were the victims? And why were they executed in such a savage way? Police noted that one older victim, dressed in a repairman's uniform, was lying beside a toolkit and a stove that was in the middle of being dismantled, suggesting he may have been a technician simply doing his job. Another was a young man in everyday clothes. Near him were a set of apartment keys and a mobile phone, implying he may have been a nearby resident. This raised a chilling possibility. Innocent people may have been caught up in the execution. The case then was no longer just a matter of criminal vendettas. It had become a tragedy for the entire community. Setting aside their sympathy for the victims, police had to focus on confirming each identity and turning those names into investigative leads. That same evening, forensic examination and identification were carried out urgently. Early results suggested that 4 of the younger victims were individuals with known profiles in police files. However, the remaining 2 victims did not match any criminal record. Police then shifted to another approach, cross-checking the building's resident list and everyone known to have been on the premises. At that point, a woman who lived on the 15th floor, Eileen Mohan, rushed to officers and reported that she had lost contact with her son, Christopher Mohan, all afternoon. Christopher had been home waiting to have lunch with her, but when she called, he never picked up. A growing sense of dread made Mrs. Mohan leave work and rush home to look for him. Seeing the mother's anxious face, police quietly brought out a victim photo for comparison. Eileen's heart shattered when she was told that one of the 6 victims was her only son. To his family, Christopher Mohan was a good kid who loved sports and had never been involved in any legal trouble. But the tragedy didn't end there. Investigators also determined that the older man who died was Ed Schellenberg, 55 years old, an HVAC, furnace technician from the nearby city of Abbotsford, on the 15th floor to service equipment for the apartments. Neighbors and friends remembered him as hardworking, kind, and devoted to his family. The identities of the other 4 victims were gradually released, and that helped explain why the scene was soaked in blood. They were all players in the drug trade. Corey Lau, 21 years old, the younger brother of Michael Lau, 26 years old. Edward Eddie Narong, 22 years old, and Ryan Bartolomeo, 19 years old. These four young men were closely associated as their own clique, referred to by police as the Lau Group because it was led by the Lau brothers. Apartment 1505, the murder scene, was also their base of operations, a place where deals and gatherings reportedly took place regularly. Records also showed that Eddie Narong had once been a co-founder of the Red Scorpions gang, but had recently split off to form his own crew. Michael and Corey Lau both had prior drug trafficking records, and were also linked to an Asian gang known as the Independent Soldiers. Ryan Bartolomeo was only 19, yet had already been tied to several incidents involving weapons and controlled substances. So who wanted these four underworld figures dead? Investigators understood that the answer likely lay in the Lau Group's connections and conflicts with larger gangs. Soon after, police received intelligence that Jamie Bacon, the leader of the Red Scorpions, had demanded that Corey Lau pay a protection fee of $100,000 in order to traffic drugs in Surrey. Corey not only refused to pay, but allegedly responded in a defiant, challenging manner. If so, that could be the motive behind the death sentence handed to the Lau brothers and their associates. However, at that point, police still had no concrete evidence. No direct witnesses were willing to come forward either. Investigators had to intensify their efforts. They reviewed security camera footage from the building and nearby areas and found elevator lobby footage showing that at around 2:40 p.m. On October 19, 2007, several figures hurriedly left the building. Helen Lee, a resident on a lower floor, also told police she saw three unfamiliar men wearing hooded sweatshirts with the hoods up, gloves on, moving quickly past the building entrance late that afternoon. They deliberately kept their faces down to avoid the cameras, and one of them even pulled his hood lower to cover most of his face. That made it very likely they were the perpetrators. One suspect was shorter than the other two and wore a gray top. The other two were taller and larger, dressed in black. Even so, identifying them precisely was impossible at that stage. With no direct evidence, investigators shifted to surveillance of potential suspects. The Bacon brothers and their close associates were placed under round-the-clock scrutiny. Court-authorized wiretaps were also used in hopes of catching any careless talk about the murders, but nothing useful surfaced. Police then pivoted to a bold psychological tactic, approaching people close to the suspects. They focused especially on girlfriends and wives of Red Scorpions members, believing they could be the weak links most vulnerable to pressure and most likely to share information. Over the 6 months after the murders, police covertly befriended and courted the trust of several suspects' girlfriends, persuading them to cooperate as witnesses. One investigator, Douglas Brassington, even became romantically involved with Jamie Bacon's ex-girlfriend, and the two had sex while she was staying in a witness protection hotel. But the real turning point came from inside the gang itself when someone involved turned himself in. It was Dennis Carbovanek, also known as Person X, a trusted Bacon associate and a Red Scorpions member. On April 3, 2009, Carbovanek went to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and confessed that he had taken part in killing 3 of the victims, including Chris Mohan. He said seeing Eileen Mohan, Chris's mother, speaking about her grief on television had filled him with guilt and pushed him to confess. Based on his statement, the next day, April 4th, 2009, police carried out a series of rapid arrests. 2 associates, Cody Ray Hayvisher and Matthew James Johnston, were taken into custody, and gang boss Jamie Bacon was also captured. Records indicate the tactical unit used an armored vehicle and a surprise entry strategy to storm the Bacon family's base in Abbotsford and subdue him as a high-risk suspect. From here, the profile of these notorious gang figures gradually came into focus. James Kyle. Jamie Bacon was born in 1985 into a middle-class family in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He didn't grow up deprived. His father was a teacher, and his mother worked at a bank. In high school, Jamie Bacon was a ranked wrestler, while his older brother Jonathan Bacon was remembered by friends as a pretty likable guy. But by their late teens, the Bacon brothers began sliding deeper into crime. According to many experts, they didn't enter the underworld out of poverty, but out of a hunger for money and status, things that could be gained quickly in that world. In 2006, the 2 brothers joined forces with the Red Scorpions to expand their influence. In a short time, Bacon rose into an ambitious young leader within the Red Scorpions, willing to use brutal violence to seize control of the market across the Lower Mainland. Arrogant and bloodthirsty, Jamie Bacon was known for wearing a bulletproof vest and being ready to fight whenever he went out. He survived an assassination attempt in April 2007, and because he was wearing body armor, he suffered only a graze to the head. But instead of backing off, Bacon treated it as part of the game and grew even more brazen. He became increasingly aggressive and muscle-obsessed, keeping up a hard, intimidating persona, quiet, sullen, feared by both friends and enemies. In the Surrey operation, Jamie Bacon did not pull the trigger himself, but he was the one directing everything from the shadows, showing extreme ruthlessness by deciding to eliminate even innocent people purely to tie off loose ends. Under Bacon were his trusted enforcers, also the men who fired the shots in the massacre. Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston were both around 23 to 24 years old at the time and were prominent Red Scorpions members. Bacon relied on them as frontline soldiers for their recklessness and loyalty. In the criminal underworld, Havisher and Johnston had been involved in higher debt collections, drug trafficking, and were willing to use weapons for the gang's benefit. Dennis Karbovanek, the one who later turned himself in, was also a seasoned butcher. All three had red scorpion tattoos as a symbol of loyalty to the gang. They regarded Jamie Bacon as a supreme leader. Once he gave an order, they carried it out without question. But that wasn't all. Among those tied to the case was a Vietnamese-Canadian co-conspirator named Michael Lay, one of the Red Scorpions co-founders, and a former prison associate of Eddie Narong. He was born in Canada to a Vietnamese family. In his youth, he became entangled in a homicide case, but narrowly escaped the heaviest consequences after a successful appeal reduced the conviction to a lesser charge. After his release, Michael Lay was determined to revive the Red Scorpions and eliminate rebellious factions. That made the Lau brothers' defiance unacceptable. But at this point, Michael Lay seemed to vanish into thin air. Authorities immediately issued an international warrant for his arrest. Investigators later learned that Michael Lay had fled to Vietnam and then moved through other Southeast Asian countries. But there was no escaping the net. On June 17, 2009, Michael Lay was arrested the moment he landed at Manila Airport in the Philippines. He was extradited back to Canada on June 29, 2009 to face justice. Around the same time, police also arrested an unexpected name, Sophan Sek, 30 years old, a broker in British Columbia's underworld. Sek was arrested on November 26, 2009, shortly after a big win at the River Rock Casino. Investigators concluded that Sophan Sek was the key link that helped the killers gain access to Unit 1505. He was hired by Michael Lay for $25,000 USD to scout the target and guide the perpetrators to the 15th floor apartment. Based on the suspect's statements and the clues collected, Canadian police were able to successfully reconstruct the entire sequence of events. On the morning of October 19, 2007, a tense atmosphere hung over a meeting at a McDonald's in the Guildford area of Surrey. Jamie Bacon angrily berated Corey for poaching his business, then coldly demanded that Corey pay $100,000 USD in tax before midnight, or he would be killed. Corey Lau appeared conciliatory at the time, but had no intention of paying such a large sum. Corey's dismissive attitude pushed Bacon past his limit. That afternoon, Bacon contacted Michael Lay, and the two agreed that Corey Lau had to be sent to hell that very day. While they were at it, they would wipe out the Lau crew in one go to prevent future trouble. Bacon immediately mobilized his men. He called Cody Havisher and Matt Johnston, two loyal butchers, and ordered them to prepare their tools. Around the same time, Dennis Karbovanek was told to join in. The group readied 2 cars for transportation. At around 1 p.m., the Bacon group had one member contact Sophan Sek, the insider, who would clear the way. Sek knew Eddie Narong, so it wasn't hard to arrange a pretext to drop by Unit 1505. He texted Eddie Narong to say he was coming over. At 1:45 p.m., Cody Havisher and Matt Johnston met Dennis Karbovanek at a rendezvous point near Balmoral Tower. The killers were carrying a Glock handgun and a Sig Sauer tucked into their waistbands. Sophan Sek joined them outside the apartment building. At around 2:25 p.m., Sek buzzed in, then led 2 men in black hoodies through the entrance and into the elevator up to the 15th floor. At 2:30 p.m., there was a knock and Sek's voice. Eddie glanced through the peephole, recognized him, and unlocked the door. The moment the door cracked open, 2 dark figures rushed in with weapons raised. Inside the unit, 4 men, Corey, Michael, Eddie, and Ryan, were immediately held at gunpoint, with no time to react. Ed Schellenberg, the repairman standing near the entryway, startled and turned around only to have Havister jam a gun to his neck and bark at him to lie face down. At the same time, out in the hallway, Chris Moen had just locked his own apartment door to head toward the elevator. Hearing the commotion, Chris turned and was grabbed by Dennis Karbovanek and dragged into Unit 1 505. At this point, all 6 victims were in the attacker's control. One by one, their hands were bound with pre-prepared plastic zip ties. Some victims even had their shoelaces stripped off and used to tie their wrists. Before dealing with their prey, the attackers took the opportunity to ransack the apartment for valuables. They tore through drawers, ripped open the sofa cushions, and smashed parts of the wall they suspected were hiding contraband. But aside from a few small packets of cocaine and some cash, there was nothing of real value. Finally, Havister glanced at Johnston and Karbovanek and signaled. The moment of execution had arrived. To avoid identification or blood spray, they grabbed jackets and hoodies already in the room and pulled them over each victim's head. In less than 2 minutes, the killers executed all 6 men, sparing no one. Then they fled quickly. Near 3 p.m., a basement security camera captured 3 dark figures sprinting across the parking area before disappearing. Dennis Karbovanek drove a BMW away from the scene, followed by a Touareg SUV carrying Havister and Johnston. They exited the lot and split up in multiple directions, leaving behind a horror scene no one had yet discovered. The investigation, though riddled with obstacles, ultimately exposed the full truth of what happened. But another tense chapter was about to begin inside the courtroom, where the justice system faced challenges rarely seen in a case of this magnitude. The Surrey case file was unprecedented in scale, with hundreds of witnesses and evidence ranging from wiretaps and security footage to criminal testimony. In September 2010, prosecutors formally charged 5 defendants, Cody Havister, Matthew Johnston, Jamie Bacon, and Michael Lay, with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Sofan Sek was charged as an accessory. Dennis Karbovanek, who had pleaded guilty and cooperated, was handled in a separate, closed proceeding and sentenced separately. The main trial began on September 30th, 2013 at the Supreme Court of British Columbia, trying Havister and Johnston on 6 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. Michael Lay also appeared in court on an aiding and abetting charge. At the very start of the trial, the prosecutors silenced the courtroom by displaying a series of chilling crime scene photographs. Witnesses were called one after another. First was Norman Carruthers, the building manager, who described discovering 6 bodies in Unit 1505 with blood all over the floor. A witness named Jason Le, a dealer in the underworld scene, testified that on October 18th, Corey Lau came to his home and threatened him, forcing him to work for Lau, suggesting Corey Lau was expanding and clashing with other groups, indirectly pointing to a motive for Bacon to strike. Forensic investigators also presented autopsy findings. A total of 19 shots had been fired, and most victims died from close-range gunshots that pierced the skull. A focal point of the trial was testimony from confidential witnesses, people who had been involved but were granted leniency in exchange for cooperating. Dennis Karbovanek described in detail the preparation and execution of the killings, admitting he personally shot 3 people. Bacon's former girlfriend testified about instances where Bacon confessed or bragged about having taken care of the Lau group. However, her testimony sparked fierce controversy. Bacon's defense team then revealed she had an inappropriate relationship with an investigator named Brassington, arguing her statements were not credible. At the same time, that revelation triggered a major scandal within the police. Judge Catherine Wedge had to convene a special evidentiary hearing on allegations of abuse of authority, an issue that nearly collapsed 2 years of investigative work. Amid that crisis, in June 2011, provincial authorities charged 4 of their own investigators, Brassington, his supervisor, and 2 colleagues with fraud, breach of duty, and obstruction of justice. Seizing on this, defense lawyers for Havister and Johnston pressed the argument that police misconduct had tainted the evidence and undermined the possibility of a fair trial. But Judge Wedge refused to dismiss the case. She allowed the trial of Havister and Johnston to proceed while excluding certain evidence obtained through violations and instructing the jury to treat testimony from specially handled witnesses with great caution. But at the last minute, Michael Lay changed course and pleaded guilty on November 28, 2013. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But because he had already spent time in pretrial detention and showed remorse, Lay later only had to serve 3 more years. In the end, after more than a year of proceedings and a record 73 witnesses, on October 2, 2014, the court found Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston guilty on all counts and sentenced them to life in prison with no parole eligibility for at least 25 years. But the legal battle didn't end there. Just days later, their defense lawyers filed a motion to overturn the convictions again, citing police misconduct. The court reviewed the request, but ultimately dismissed it, and Havisher and Johnston remained convicted as ruled. Meanwhile, the prosecution of Jamie Bacon took many more unexpected turns. After his arrest in 2009, Bacon hired a large, high-powered legal team. He tried to stall and loudly contested every procedural issue, pushing the main trial back by years. In December 2017, a major shock hit. Justice Heather Holmes of the Supreme Court issued a permanent stay of the murder prosecution against Jamie Bacon, ruling that police and prosecutors had seriously violated Bacon's right to a fair trial. Earlier, a 2010 court decision had also gone in Bacon's favor, ordering the jail to pay damages, an outcome that stunned the victims' families and outraged the public. Facing a wave of backlash, British Columbia prosecutors appealed to the Court of Appeal. That effort succeeded. In May 2020, the Court of Appeal overturned the stay, clearing the way for Jamie Bacon to be prosecuted again. Confronted with the risk of going to trial and receiving a heavy sentence, Bacon chose to negotiate a plea deal for a lighter outcome. On July 9, 2020, Jamie Bacon formally pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and to counseling murder in a separate case. In September 2020, the court sentenced Bacon to 18 years in prison, but counting his pretrial custody, he had only 5 years and 7 months left to serve. The victims' families were, of course, unhappy with that sentence. Prosecutors explained that if they tried Bacon for murder at that point, the process could drag on for many more years and a conviction was not guaranteed, since indirect evidence had grown weaker over time. As for Stefanczak, his case also dragged on for years. Not until late 2015 did Sek plead guilty to breaking and entering with a weapon with intent to commit an indictable offense. In December 2015, the court sentenced Sek to 1 year in prison for his indirect role as the guide. And as for Denis Karbovanec, because he pleaded guilty early, even though he personally killed 3 people, he received a sentence of only 15 years. Even so, for the victims' families, the legal journey still wasn't fully over. In January 2021, the Court of Appeal issued a surprising ruling. Because new evidence of police misconduct had emerged, Havisher and Johnston were allowed to seek a hearing to have the indictment stayed. Prosecutors immediately objected strongly and appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. In April 2023, the Supreme Court of Canada issued its final decision, upholding Havisher's right to proceed with a misconduct hearing. That meant that by October 2025, the horrific massacre that happened back in 2007 still had not reached a definitive end. The victims' families continued to follow every step of the justice process. Eileen Mohan even worried that the case might still be unresolved by the time she passed away. So what do you think lies ahead for both the suspects and the victims' families? And has justice truly been served yet? Let Vietnamese Case Files know in the comments. And if you found today's story compelling, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Vietnamese Case Files to keep following more gripping cases in the future. Goodbye and see you next time.